The morning my husband found me at a family shelter was the moment my life split into two completely different realities. My son Noah and I were sitting at a small plastic table near the back wall of the shelter in Phoenix, Arizona. It was early morning, the kind of quiet hour when the city outside was just starting to wake up. Volunteers moved around the room, placing trays of scrambled eggs and toast on folding tables, while the smell of coffee drifted through the air. Noah was drawing dinosaurs on the back of a worksheet someone had donated for the kids. His small sneakers swung under the chair as he focused carefully on the spikes of a stegosaurus. From the outside, it probably looked like an ordinary morning. But the truth was that my 8-year-old son and I had been living in that shelter for nearly a week. I was staring down at my coffee, trying to calculate how long we could stay there before I had to figure out something else. When a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, at first, I barely noticed it. Expensive cars occasionally showed up at the shelter. Sometimes local businesses donated supplies or volunteers came by to help families find housing. But something about the car made several people in the room look up. The engine stopped. The driver's door opened. And the moment the man stepped out, my entire body froze. It was my husband, Marcus Carter. The man I believed had abandoned us 2 months earlier was now walking toward the entrance of the very shelter where my son and I had been sleeping. For a second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then he looked up, and our eyes met through the glass doors. The room around me fell completely silent. Noah noticed him next. He tugged lightly on my sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, squinting toward the entrance. "That looks like Dad." I couldn't answer, because by then Marcus had already pushed open the door and stepped inside. He looked exactly the same as the last time I saw him. Tall, confident, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than everything I owned at that moment. But the expression on his face wasn't what I expected. He wasn't angry. He wasn't distant. He looked confused. Marcus scanned the room slowly until his eyes landed on me and Noah sitting at that small plastic table. For a moment he didn't move. Then he walked toward us. Each step seemed to make the room quieter. A few parents nearby pretended to keep eating while their eyes followed him across the floor. Marcus stopped a few feet from our table. "Lydia," he said. The way he said my name sounded uncertain, like he wasn't sure the person he was looking at was really me. His eyes moved from my face to Noah and then around the shelter, to the worn chairs, the folding tables, the families sitting quietly with donated backpacks at their feet. Then his gaze came back to me. "Why are you here?" he asked. The question made my chest tighten, because the way he asked it didn't sound like someone who already knew the answer. I swallowed slowly. "You're supposed to be in Singapore," I said. Marcus frowned. "I just got back yesterday," he replied. That answer made my mind spin. For 2 months I had been living with a completely different version of reality, a version my brother Daniel and my sister Claire repeated so often that it eventually felt like the truth. They told me Marcus's company was under investigation. They said he had frozen our accounts. They claimed he had disappeared overseas to protect himself from a financial scandal. Every decision I made after that was based on those assumptions. But as Marcus stood in front of me inside that shelter, nothing about his reaction matched the story I had been told. Noah slid out of his chair and wrapped his arms around Marcus's waist. "Dad," he said quietly. Marcus immediately knelt down and hugged him tightly. "What are you doing here?" "Buddy," he asked softly. Noah looked up at him with the simple honesty only a child can have. "We live here right now," he said. Marcus's head lifted slowly. He looked at me again, this time with a completely different expression. Shock. Real shock. "You're living here?" he asked. I nodded. For a moment Marcus didn't speak. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes studying my face as if he was trying to understand a puzzle that made no sense. "Lydia," he said quietly. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words felt stuck in my throat, because in that moment something terrifying began forming in my mind. Marcus didn't look like a man who had abandoned his family. He looked like a man who had just discovered something was very wrong. And if Marcus truly didn't know where Noah and I had been living for the past 2 months, then the people who told me my husband had disappeared might have been lying. Marcus glanced around the shelter again. At the tired families. At the volunteers quietly pretending not to listen. At my son sitting beside me with a paper plate of eggs. When he looked back at me, his voice had changed. Lower. Sharper. What did your family do to you? 2 months earlier. My life still looked normal from the outside. Marcus had been traveling constantly that year because his technology company was expanding overseas. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone for several weeks at a time, especially when new international partnerships were involved. I had grown used to managing things at home while he handled business. When he left for Singapore that spring, nothing felt different about the goodbye. Noah and I drove him to the airport just like we always did. Marcus hugged our son tightly and promised to bring back something special from the trip. Noah immediately asked for a toy robot from the airport stores. Marcus laughed and agreed. Before walking through security, he turned back and kissed my forehead. 3 weeks, he said. Then I'm home. At the time, I believed him completely. The first sign that something was wrong appeared about a week after Marcus left. It was a late evening when my phone rang. I was cleaning the kitchen while Noah finished homework at the table. The caller ID showed my older brother's name. Daniel rarely called that late unless something important had happened. When I answered, his voice sounded unusually serious. Lydia, he said. Have you seen the news about Marcus's company? I hadn't. Daniel sighed heavily. There are rumors going around about financial fraud, he said. Regulators might be investigating some of the executives. For a moment I just stared at the wall, trying to process what he had said. That didn't sound like Marcus at all. Marcus had always been extremely careful with business decisions. There must be a mistake, I said. Daniel didn't sound convinced. I hope so, he replied. But things like this can get messy fast. After we hung up, I searched online for information about the company. Most of what I found were vague articles and forum discussions. Some of them looked unreliable, but the headlines were unsettling enough to make me uneasy. The next afternoon, Daniel showed up at my house. He wasn't alone. My sister Claire stepped in behind him carrying a bag of groceries. Claire hugged me tightly the moment she walked through the door. We just want to make sure you're okay, she said. Daniel moved straight to the living room and opened his laptop. He began explaining that if Marcus's company was under investigation, certain financial protections might become necessary. His tone sounded professional, almost like he had rehearsed the conversation. Companies sometimes freeze family accounts during legal reviews, he said. You need to be prepared in case that happens. The words immediately made me nervous. I had never been deeply involved in Marcus's financial management. His company structure was complicated, and he usually handled the details. Claire noticed my hesitation. Lydia, she said gently. Do you actually control any of the accounts? Or does Marcus manage everything? I admitted that Marcus managed most of them. Claire and Daniel exchanged a quick glance. At the time I thought they were worried about me. Looking back now, that moment feels very different. Over the next several days they began visiting more often. Claire brought food and helped Noah with schoolwork. Daniel constantly checked business news and sent me articles about financial scandals involving other companies. Each time he mentioned Marcus's name, the situation sounded more serious. One evening, Daniel arrived with printed documents. He spread them across the kitchen table and pointed at rows of numbers and transaction records I didn't fully understand. These look like offshore transfers, he said. The documents looked official enough to make my stomach tighten. Marcus may be trying to protect himself if regulators start digging, Daniel continued. Claire placed a hand on my shoulder. You need to think about Noah, she said softly. If the government freezes everything, you could lose the house. Hearing those words made my heart race. Losing our home had never even crossed my mind before that moment. Meanwhile, my communication with Marcus started feeling strange. Some of my messages took hours to receive a reply. Other times, he simply sent short responses saying he was busy with meetings. Daniel noticed immediately. See? He said one evening after reading one of the brief texts. He's avoiding real conversations. I wanted to argue with him, but the doubt had already begun creeping into my mind. A few days later, Daniel arrived with another folder. This time he explained that a temporary legal structure could protect our home and certain assets until the investigation rumors settled down. According to him, it was a common strategy used by families when business partners were under financial scrutiny. Claire nodded in agreement. Our family lawyer helped with situations like this before, she said. I remember sitting at the kitchen table staring at the stack of documents they placed in front of me. My husband was thousands of miles away. The internet was full of rumors about his company, and my own siblings were telling me that acting quickly was the only way to protect my child. So I did something I never imagined I would do. I picked up the pen. At the time, I believed I was signing temporary protections. I had no idea those documents would eventually lead to the night Noah and I stood outside our own house, while strangers carried our belongings to the curb. At the time, signing those documents felt like the responsible thing to do. Daniel and Claire spoke with such confidence that I convinced myself they understood the legal situation better than I ever could. Marcus was thousands of miles away dealing with whatever was happening at his company, and my siblings had stepped in to help. At least that's what I believed. During the first week after signing the paperwork, everything seemed calm. Daniel visited often, sometimes bringing additional documents that he said were small updates to the protective structure around the house and accounts. Claire spent time with Noah and reassured me that everything would settle down once the rumors about Marcus's company faded. But slowly, small details began to change. Daniel started asking for access to utility records and insurance documents connected to the house. Claire asked questions about several investment accounts Marcus had mentioned years earlier. At the time, their requests sounded reasonable. They said they were simply organizing paperwork in case investigators contacted our family. Still, something about the constant paperwork made me uneasy. One afternoon, Daniel arrived with a man I had never seen before. "This is Thomas," Daniel said casually. "He's helping review the legal documents." Thomas barely introduced himself before sitting at the dining table and opening a laptop. He spoke in complicated legal language about asset protection and liability exposure. Most of it went over my head. At one point, I asked whether I should wait to discuss these things with Marcus first. Daniel immediately shook his head. "You don't want to involve him right now," he said firmly. "If authorities think he's transferring assets through family members, it could make things worse." His explanation sounded logical enough to silence my doubts. After Thomas left, Claire poured me a cup of tea and smiled reassuringly. "You're doing the right thing," she said. I wanted to believe her. A few days later, something happened that I still remember clearly. I was walking toward the kitchen when I heard Daniel and Claire talking quietly near the back door. Their voices were low, almost whispering. Daniel sounded frustrated. "She wasn't supposed to question it," he muttered. Claire replied quickly, "Just give it another week. She'll sign the rest." My footsteps made the floor creak and their conversation stopped immediately. When I stepped into the room, they both looked at me with identical smiles. "What are you two talking about?" I asked. "Nothing important," Claire said lightly. I told myself I had misunderstood. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't disappear. The tension grew stronger a few weeks later. Daniel arrived one evening carrying another thick folder. His mood was completely different from before. He looked impatient. "We need to finalize the property transfer tonight," he said. The words immediately made me uncomfortable. "Property transfer," I repeated. "You said this was temporary?" Daniel sighed like I was being difficult. "It is temporary," he said. "But the house needs to be moved into a protective holding structure. Otherwise, creditors could take it." Claire nodded from the kitchen. "Lydia, you're protecting Noah's future," she added gently. Something inside me finally resisted. "I'm not signing anything else until I talk to Marcus," I said. The room went quiet. Daniel's expression hardened. "You're being naive," he said sharply. "Marcus already created this mess." The argument that followed was the worst fight I had ever had with my siblings. Daniel accused Marcus of dragging our family into a financial scandal. Claire insisted that I was putting my son at risk by refusing their help. But for the first time since this whole situation began, I stood my ground. "I'm done signing things," I told them. They left shortly after that. The house felt strangely quiet once they were gone. 2 days later, Noah and I returned from school and grocery shopping. As we walked up the driveway, something felt wrong immediately. The front door lock looked different. I tried my key. It didn't work. At first I thought maybe the lock had been repaired. I knocked on the door. After a moment it opened. Claire stood there. Daniel was behind her holding a stack of papers. "Why doesn't my key work?" I asked. Daniel stepped forward calmly. "The property ownership has been transferred," he said. "You're not authorized to live here anymore." For several seconds I couldn't understand what he meant. "This is my house," I said. Daniel handed me a document. My signature was printed clearly at the bottom. Before I could respond, 2 moving trucks pulled up behind us. Workers began carrying boxes out of the house. My boxes, Noah's toys, family photographs. Everything we owned was placed on the curb like discarded furniture. Noah squeezed my hand tightly. "Mom, what's happening?" he whispered. I didn't know what to say. Claire knelt down beside him with a soft smile. "It's just temporary," she told him gently. "Your mom needs to figure some things out." But when she stood up again, her eyes never met mine. By sunset, our belongings were piled beside the driveway. Daniel closed the front door and locked it. The house where my son had grown up was suddenly no longer ours. That night, Noah and I slept in the car for the first time. I sat in the driver's seat watching the lights inside the house slowly turn off. And as the darkness settled around us, a terrifying thought crept into my mind. If Marcus truly had disappeared the way Daniel claimed, then my son and I were completely alone. The first night Noah and I slept in the car, I told him it was just temporary. I parked in the corner of a grocery store parking lot where the lights stayed on all night. The yellow glow from the street lamps made the inside of the car feel less frightening, even though every passing vehicle made my heart jump. Noah curled up in the passenger seat holding his stuffed dinosaur. "Are we camping?" he asked sleepily. "Yes," I told him, forcing a smile. "Just for a few days." He accepted that answer the way children often accept things adults struggle to explain. Within minutes he was asleep. I stayed awake most of the night staring through the windshield, trying to convince myself everything would be solved once Marcus came home. The next morning I drove Noah to school as if nothing had changed. I parked a few streets away from the building so none of the other parents would notice our car full of boxes. After dropping him off, I spent the day driving around Phoenix trying to figure out what to do next. I still believed Marcus would return soon and explain everything. But the days kept passing, and the answers never came. After several nights in the car, I used the last of my available cash to book a small motel room. The building looked worn, and the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. But when Noah jumped onto the bed and laughed, it felt like a small victory. At least he could sleep comfortably. During those days I kept trying to contact Marcus. Some of my messages went unanswered for hours, sometimes even days. When he did reply, his responses were short. "Busy in meetings. Talk later." Those brief messages made Daniel's warnings echo louder in my mind. Maybe Marcus really was avoiding me. Maybe the rumors about his company were worse than he admitted. Meanwhile, the money I had left began disappearing quickly. Every expense felt heavy. Gas. Food. Motel fees. School supplies. I kept calculating how many days we could survive before everything ran out. One afternoon, I decided to withdraw money from a small savings account I believed was still active. I drove to the bank and waited in line, trying to appear calm, when the teller checked the account. Her expression changed slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "This account was closed several weeks ago." Closed. The word echoed in my head. "I didn't close it," I replied. She checked the screen again. "According to the records, the authorization was processed with proper identification." I left the bank feeling like the ground beneath my feet was disappearing. Without that account, I had almost nothing left. For several days, I avoided thinking about what that meant. But eventually the truth became impossible to ignore. The last motel payment emptied nearly all the cash I had. That night, while Noah slept beside me, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. I searched for local assistance programs, community shelters, emergency housing. The idea of walking into a shelter felt humiliating. Just weeks earlier, I had been living in a comfortable home with a stable life. Now I was considering something I had never imagined for myself. But when I looked at Noah sleeping peacefully, I knew pride didn't matter anymore. His safety did. The next morning, I called a number listed on a local community center website. The woman on the phone spoke gently and asked a few simple questions. When I told her I had a child, she said there was space available at a family shelter. By afternoon, Noah and I were standing in front of a modest building on the edge of the city. The shelter staff welcomed us with quiet kindness. They showed us a small sleeping area separated from other families by thin partitions. It wasn't much, but it was safe. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't have to worry about where Noah would sleep that night. Still, I tried to keep my distance from everyone there. I avoided conversations and spent most of my time reading or helping Noah with schoolwork. I didn't want anyone asking questions about how we ended up there. A few days later, one of the shelter coordinators approached me during breakfast. Her name was Teresa Alvarez. She had a calm voice and observant eyes that seemed to notice everything. "I heard you've been dealing with some complicated paperwork," she said. I hesitated before answering. Eventually, I told her a little about the documents Daniel had asked me to sign. Teresa asked if she could take a look. Later that afternoon, we sat together in a small office while she carefully reviewed the papers. Her expression remained neutral for several minutes. Then she looked up. "Did you hire the attorney listed on these documents?" she asked. "No," I said. "My brother said it was our family lawyer." Teresa studied the page again. "These transfers are unusually complicated," she said slowly. Her tone wasn't accusing, but something about the way she said it made a quiet doubt form in my mind. Over the next few days, she helped me examine several other documents. Some of the company names were unfamiliar. Several signatures looked inconsistent. Certain dates didn't line up with the timeline Daniel had explained. For the first time, I started wondering if the situation might not be exactly what my siblings claimed. But even then, part of me refused to believe they would betray me like that. One cold morning, Noah and I sat quietly in the shelter dining area eating breakfast. The room was filled with soft conversations and the clinking of plastic forks against paper plates. Through the front window, I noticed a black SUV slowly pulling into the parking lot. At first, I assumed it belonged to a volunteer. But something about the car made several people in the room glance up. The engine stopped. The door opened, and the man who stepped out was the last person I ever expected to see there. My husband. For a few seconds after Marcus stepped into the shelter, I couldn't move. The entire room felt strangely quiet, like everyone around us had suddenly decided to listen without making it obvious. Marcus stood in the doorway looking completely out of place. His coat was dark and perfectly pressed, his shoes clean, his posture confident in the way it always had been. But the expression on his face wasn't confident at all. It was confusion. Real confusion. His eyes moved across the room slowly until they stopped on me and Noah sitting at the plastic table. "Lydia," he said. My name sounded uncertain in his voice, almost like he was testing whether I was really there. Noah reacted before I could say anything. He jumped out of his chair and ran across the floor. "Dad." Marcus immediately bent down and caught him in a tight hug. "What are you doing here, buddy?" he asked, his voice softer than I had heard in months. Noah looked up at him with complete honesty. "We live here right now," he said. Marcus froze. For a moment he didn't react at all. Then he slowly stood up and looked at me again. "You're living here?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without taking his eyes off my face. "Lydia," he said carefully. "What happened?" For weeks I had imagined this moment. I had rehearsed the words in my head 100 different times. But now that he was sitting in front of me, nothing came out the way I expected. "You disappeared," I said. Marcus frowned immediately. I didn't disappear. You stopped answering. I continued. Our accounts were frozen. Daniel said your company was under investigation. Marcus leaned back slightly. What investigation? The confusion in his voice made my stomach twist. I started explaining everything. The rumors online about his company. Daniel showing up with financial documents. Claire insisting we needed to protect the house. The paperwork they convinced me to sign. And finally, the night Noah and I came home to find the locks changed. As I talked, Marcus's expression changed slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then anger. Wait, he said suddenly, raising a hand. He pulled out his phone and opened several financial apps. Look at this, he said, turning the screen toward me. Our accounts were there, active, not frozen, not empty. I stared at the numbers in shock. But Daniel said, Daniel doesn't control my company's finances. Marcus interrupted. He scrolled through recent activity. There were transactions from these accounts, he said slowly. But I didn't authorize them. My heart began pounding. Marcus opened another app and checked his call logs. I've been calling you for weeks, he said. I looked at my phone. Several of the calls he showed me had never appeared on my device. Marcus's jaw tightened. Someone blocked our communication, he said. The realization settled over both of us at the same time. Marcus held out his hand. Do you still have the documents your brother made you sign? I nodded and pulled the folder from my bag. He flipped through the pages quickly. At first his face showed only concentration. But the longer he read, the darker his expression became. These aren't protection agreements, he said quietly. What do you mean? Marcus pointed to a section near the bottom of one page. This transfers ownership. Of what? Everything. He kept turning pages. The house. My chest tightened. Several investment accounts. My stomach twisted. And part of your inheritance. I blinked at him. My inheritance. Marcus nodded. Your grandmother's estate shares? Remember the real estate company she partially left to you? I did remember. My grandmother had left me a minority share in a regional property development business years earlier. At the time, it had seemed like a symbolic gesture more than anything else. Marcus continued reading. These documents transferred those shares to another company. What company? Marcus tapped the page. The company name meant nothing to me, but Marcus immediately began searching for it online. Within seconds, the registration records appeared. Marcus stared at the screen. Then he slowly turned the phone toward me. The owner of the company listed in the registration was Daniel. My brother. The air seemed to leave my lungs. They used shell companies, Marcus said quietly. They what? Fake businesses designed to move assets quietly. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. For a moment he looked around the shelter. At the tired families eating breakfast. At the volunteers pretending not to listen. At Noah sitting beside us with his paper plate of eggs. Then he looked back at me. The calm expression on his face was gone. What replaced it was something colder. They didn't just trick you, he said slowly. They planned this. Marcus stood up and pulled out his phone again. He dialed a number and waited. When someone answered, his voice became calm but sharp. I need the legal team in Phoenix immediately, he said. He paused while the person on the other end responded. Yes, he added. Fraud. Asset transfer. Identity manipulation. He ended the call and sat down again. Marcus, I whispered. What does this mean? He looked directly at me. It means your brother and sister didn't just take your house. He tapped the folder. They tried to steal everything. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning around me. Marcus leaned closer and lowered his voice. And Lydia, he added quietly, they're about to regret it. For weeks, I had felt like my life was slipping out of my hands. But the moment Marcus finished that phone call inside the shelter, something shifted. Daniel and Claire believed they had outsmarted me. They believed I was alone, confused, and too overwhelmed to fight back. What they didn't realize was that Marcus had just stepped into the situation. And Marcus Carter was not someone people outmaneuvered easily. Pack your things, he said quietly. I blinked at him. What? You and Noah aren't staying here another night. The words felt unreal. Just hours earlier, I had accepted the shelter as our only option. Now Marcus was standing there like the entire situation had already changed. Within 15 minutes, we had gathered the few belongings Noah and I had brought with us. Before leaving, Marcus walked over to Teresa, the shelter coordinator who had helped me review the documents earlier that week. Thank you for helping my wife, he said sincerely. Teresa nodded politely. I had a feeling something about those papers wasn't right, she replied. Marcus glanced at the folder in my hands. Would it be possible to get copies of everything Lydia showed you? He asked. Teresa smiled slightly. I already made them. She handed him a small envelope. People who manipulate financial documents tend to leave trails, she added quietly. Marcus's eyes sharpened slightly. That's exactly what I'm hoping. Once we were outside, the sunlight felt strangely bright after the dim shelter interior. Marcus opened the back door of the black SUV so Noah could climb in. For the first time in weeks, my son looked relaxed. He immediately began talking excitedly about the dinosaur drawings he had made that morning. Marcus listened carefully while starting the engine. As we pulled out of the parking lot, he picked up his phone again. The first call went to his company's legal department. I need the Arizona team ready within a few hours, he said calmly. We're dealing with fraudulent asset transfers. The second call went to someone else, a forensic accounting firm in Las Vegas. I sat quietly in the passenger seat while he explained the situation piece by piece. The language he used sounded technical and precise. Shell corporations, ownership transfers, unauthorized signatures. Listening to him speak made me realize just how serious the situation had become. After the call ended, Marcus glanced at me. There's something I need to ask, he said. What? Your grandmother's estate. I frowned slightly. What about it? Marcus kept his eyes on the road. When she passed away, she left you a minority share in the family real estate company, right? Yes, I said slowly. My grandmother had owned several properties before she died. The will divided those assets between different relatives, but she had insisted that I receive a portion of the company's shares. At the time, it felt symbolic more than valuable. Daniel had been furious about it. He thought those shares should belong to him. I added quietly. Marcus nodded. That's what I suspected. Why? He tapped the folder on the center console. Because some of these documents reference that company, a cold feeling spread through my chest. You think Daniel wanted control of the business? Marcus exhaled slowly. If he owns your shares, he could eventually gain majority control. The idea made my stomach turn. Several hours later, we arrived at a modern office building in downtown Phoenix. Marcus's legal team was already waiting inside a conference room. 3 attorneys and a forensic accountant sat around a large table reviewing the documents. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. The forensic accountant moved through the paperwork methodically, tracing each transfer from one company to another. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair. These companies were created only weeks before the property transfer, he said. One of the attorneys nodded. Classic shell structure, she added. Marcus folded his arms. Can we prove fraud? The attorney tapped one of the documents. Possibly, but confronting them immediately could give them time to hide evidence. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. Then we don't confront them yet. Everyone at the table looked at him. We let them keep going. Marcus continued. If they believe the plan worked, they'll keep moving assets. Every transfer becomes another piece of evidence. The forensic accountant smiled slightly. They'll dig their own hole. Marcus nodded. That's the idea. I shifted uneasily in my chair. Watching my siblings continue their scheme felt wrong. Despite everything, part of me still struggled to accept that Daniel and Claire had betrayed me so completely. Marcus noticed my hesitation. They didn't just take your house, he said quietly. They put your son in a shelter. The reminder tightened my chest. He was right. That night, as the legal team continued reviewing the financial trail, the forensic accountant suddenly paused. Wait, he said. Everyone turned toward his screen. There's another name appearing in these transactions. Marcus stepped closer. Who? The accountant rotated the laptop toward us. The name listed as an advisory partner on several company transfers made my heart stop. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Claire. It was someone else. Someone I had trusted for years. Our family lawyer. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. Well, he said quietly. That explains how they pulled it off. The room fell silent as the full scope of the betrayal finally became clear. When the name of our family lawyer appeared on the screen, the room went completely silent. For years he had handled paperwork for birthdays, property transfers, and even my grandmother's will. He had been at family dinners. He had shaken Marcus's hand countless times. And now his name was sitting in the middle of a financial trail that led directly to the theft of my life. Marcus leaned closer to the laptop. Are you sure? He asked the forensic accountant. The man nodded. These companies didn't move money alone, he said. Every transaction was legally authorized through someone with legal access. He tapped the screen. That's him. The realization felt heavier than anything Daniel and Claire had done. Because my siblings might have been greedy. But our lawyer had known exactly how to make the fraud look legitimate. Marcus straightened slowly. So they had professional help, he said quietly. One of the attorneys nodded. That means they believed they could get away with it. Marcus looked around the table. Then we make sure they don't. Instead of filing immediate charges, Marcus's legal team decided on a different approach. If Daniel and Claire believed their plan had succeeded, they would continue moving assets and consolidating control of the business. Every new transaction would create more evidence. So for the next several days we stayed quiet. Investigators monitored the shell companies. Financial analysts tracked the movement of funds. And just as Marcus predicted, Daniel kept expanding. New properties were purchased under the company names. Additional investment accounts were opened. Each move strengthened the case against them. Then one morning, the forensic accountant called Marcus with an update. There's a meeting scheduled, he said. Marcus put the call on speaker so I could hear. What kind of meeting? Marcus asked. Daniel, Claire, and the lawyer, the accountant replied. They're planning to finalize restructuring of the family real estate company. Marcus exchanged a glance with his attorneys. When? Tomorrow afternoon? A slow smile appeared on Marcus's face. Perfect. That meeting would become the moment everything collapsed. Marcus arranged for several legal investigators and financial regulators to attend the meeting under the pretense of reviewing company documentation. Daniel believed he was walking into a celebration. He had no idea it was actually an investigation. The next day, we arrived at the office building where the family real estate company operated. I hadn't been inside that building in years. My grandmother used to bring me there when I was younger. Now I was walking through the same doors knowing my own siblings had used that company as the center of their scheme. Daniel and Claire were already inside the conference room when we entered. Daniel stood beside the large window looking confident. Claire was laughing with the lawyer as if nothing had ever happened. The moment Daniel saw Marcus, his smile faded. You're back early, he said carefully. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down calmly. I thought it was time to see how the family business was doing. Daniel glanced at Claire. For a second they both looked uncertain. But the lawyer stepped forward smoothly. We were just reviewing the restructuring paperwork, he said. Daniel nodded quickly. Lydia voluntarily transferred her shares, he added. The words felt surreal. He was still pretending nothing illegal had happened. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Is that so? One of Marcus's attorneys placed a thick folder on the table. Before we continue, she said, we'd like to review some financial records. Daniel frowned. What records? The forensic accountant stepped forward. Every transaction connected to the companies that received Lydia's assets. The room grew quiet. The lawyer shifted slightly in his seat. Marcus watched them carefully. We traced the transfers, he said calmly. Every shell company, every signature, every approval. He opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Ownership transfers, transaction records, corporate registrations. And right in the middle of the pages were the signatures that connected everything. Daniel's face turned pale. Claire stared at the documents in disbelief. The lawyer's expression tightened. One of the investigators spoke next. These documents indicate fraudulent asset transfers, forged authorizations, and financial theft. Claire shook her head quickly. "This is ridiculous," she said. Lydia signed everything voluntarily. Marcus nodded slowly. She did. Then he slid another document across the table. A forensic report showing how several signatures had been modified digitally before being processed. The lawyer's hands trembled slightly. Daniel stood up abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. But the investigators had already surrounded the table. One of them spoke firmly. "This meeting is now part of an official investigation." The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier vanished. Claire's voice cracked as she tried to explain. Daniel looked like he was searching desperately for an escape. But the evidence was already everywhere. Marcus turned toward me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he nodded gently. It was my turn to speak. I looked at my brother and sister across the table. "You remember the night Noah and I stood outside our house?" I asked quietly. Neither of them answered. "You remember watching your nephew sit in the car while strangers carried our belongings to the curb?" Claire looked down at the floor. Daniel clenched his fists. "For weeks." I continued. "My son asked me when we were going home." The room was completely silent now. Daniel suddenly tried to step toward the door, but one of the investigators blocked his path. "This meeting isn't finished," he said firmly. Marcus leaned back in his chair and watched them calmly. Then he spoke. "You thought you won," he said. Daniel stared at him. Marcus's voice was steady. "But this," he added, gesturing to the room full of investigators and documents, "is where your plan actually ends." Daniel looked around the room and finally understood. And the fear in his eyes told me he knew exactly how serious the situation had become. The moment Daniel realized the investigators were serious, the confidence drained from his face. For weeks he had behaved like someone who believed he was untouchable. Now he looked like a man who finally understood the consequences of what he had done. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the documents spread across the conference table. The lawyer who had helped them sat silently, his expression tight and pale. One of the investigators stepped forward and began explaining the legal situation. Because the documents contained forged authorizations and fraudulent transfers, the case was no longer just a family dispute. It was financial fraud, corporate theft, identity manipulation. Each charge carried serious legal consequences. Daniel tried to interrupt several times, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. But every time he spoke, another document appeared on the table. Transaction histories, corporate registrations, witness statements. The evidence stacked up faster than he could argue against it. Marcus never raised his voice. He simply sat there calmly while the truth unfolded piece by piece. Watching him in that moment reminded me of something I had always known about my husband. Marcus was patient, and patient people were often the most dangerous when someone crossed them. Eventually, the investigators asked Daniel and Claire to remain in the room while they completed the initial report. Marcus stood up slowly. He placed one final document on the table. It was the original ownership agreement of my grandmother's real estate company. The agreement clearly showed that my shares had been transferred illegally through the shell corporations. Daniel stared at the paper like he had never seen it before. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You should have stopped when you took the house," he said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. Marcus straightened his jacket and walked toward the door. The meeting was over. Outside the building, the warm Phoenix air felt almost surreal after the tension of the conference room. I stood beside Marcus in the parking lot while everything slowly settled in my mind. For months I had felt like my life was collapsing. But now the truth was finally out. Within a few weeks, the legal process moved faster than I expected. Because the financial evidence was so clear, several court orders were issued almost immediately. The shell companies used by Daniel and Claire were frozen. Ownership transfers connected to the fraudulent documents were suspended. Investigators began reviewing the full list of transactions connected to the scheme. One by one, the assets they had taken began returning to their rightful ownership. The house, the investment accounts, my shares of the real estate company my grandmother had built. For the first time since that terrible night when Noah and I stood outside our home with our belongings on the curb, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was solid again. Several weeks later, Marcus and I drove back to the house. The same driveway, the same front door, but everything felt different. Noah ran ahead of us when we unlocked the door. The moment he stepped inside the living room, his face lit up. "We're really home?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "Yes. Buddy." Noah dropped his backpack and ran through the house laughing. Watching him move through those familiar rooms made my chest tighten. Not with fear, but with relief. Marcus stood beside me in the hallway and gently wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "You handled all of this better than you think," he said. I shook my head slightly. I didn't feel strong. He smiled. "Strength doesn't mean you never fall," he said. "It means you keep going even when everything is falling apart." That night after Noah went to sleep, Marcus and I sat quietly at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel and Claire had once spread those documents in front of me. Now the room felt peaceful again. But something inside me had changed. I realized that the hardest part of the entire experience wasn't losing the house. It wasn't the nights in the car. And it wasn't even the shelter. The hardest part had been accepting that the people who betrayed me were the ones I had trusted my entire life. For years I believed loyalty meant forgiving everything simply because someone was family. Now I understood something different. Real family doesn't destroy your life for personal gain. Real family protects you. As for Daniel and Claire, the legal consequences of their actions were still unfolding. Fraud investigations take time, but the evidence against them was strong. Marcus assured me the system would handle the rest. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to let it. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger. It's rebuilding your life while the people who tried to destroy it face the consequences of their own choices. Looking back now, the moment that changed everything was the morning Marcus stepped out of that black SUV outside the shelter. At the time, I thought my life had reached its lowest point. But that moment was actually the beginning of the truth finally coming to light. Sometimes the darkest moments reveal who is truly standing beside you. And sometimes the people you think will never betray you turn out to be the ones who do. But if there's one thing I learned from this entire experience, it's that losing everything doesn't mean your story is over. Sometimes it's just the moment where the real story begins. And I'm curious what you would have done if you were in my situation. Would you have confronted your family the same way? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about real-life family drama, hidden betrayals, and moments when the truth finally comes out, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened.